Hi, everyone. Hi. Welcome. My name is Greer Luce. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at Morven. I'm thrilled to introduce this evening's program, The Costs of Luxury, Mahogany, and Tall Case Clocks in Early America. This program is the second that we are holding in conjunction with Morven's newest exhibition, Striking Beauty, New Jersey Tall Case Clocks, 1730 to 1830. The exhibit features 50 tall case clocks made in New Jersey, exploring the clockmakers and craftsmanship behind each unique piece. Today's program will examine the social and environmental history behind mahogany, one of the popular materials used in New Jersey clock cabinet and furniture making. Today's speaker, Jennifer Anderson, is Associate Professor of History at Stonybrook University. She holds a PhD in Atlantic and Early American History from New York University. She is the author of Mahogany, The Costs of Luxury in Early America, about the social and environmental history of the tropical timber trade in the 18th century. Admittedly, this book was required reading in my museum studies graduate program, so it's a bit close to my heart. It encouraged me to look at the material culture and think deeply about the full story, asking who and what is behind the beautiful and historic early American furniture that dots museums and historic homes up and down the East Coast and beyond. Dr. Anderson has received many awards and fellowships, including the 2016 Murrin Prize and the Society of American Historians Nevins Prize. She headed the research team for the Emmy-nominated documentary Traces of the Trade about the New England slave trade, and in 2013, she curated an exhibition about Sylvester Manor, a 17th century plantation in New York. Her new research focuses on reinterpreting the complex human and environmental history of Long Island within the broader Atlantic context. Strongly committed to public history, she serves as a historical consultant at numerous historic sites and museums. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Anderson.
Plug my clock in here, so keep me honest. Oh, yes, indeed. And I want to leave time for Q&A always, so I will just put that on in a second. But I wanted to first begin by thanking my host and Greer. It's lovely to be here. And to congratulate the curators. Did you guys see the exhibit beforehand? How many of you have it? Yeah. Can we give them a hand? Like, it's spectacular. And I was walking through there trying to imagine how did you maneuver all of those different pieces? What a puzzle it must have been, but it really, what a magnificent accomplishment, and congratulations. I've read, I must preface my remarks by saying, I am not an expert on clocks, and I'm not an expert on New Jersey furniture per se. So I understand there's going to be a curatorial tour. Is it next week? July, coming up in July. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, I recommend you come back for that program because I expect it'll be quite delightful. But I was going to say, yeah, I've looked and read, a lot of books about New Jersey clocks and New Jersey furniture, but never have I seen them lined up like that in person. And so just to back up the train a little bit, when Greer actually emailed me, I guess, back in the beginning of the year, asking if I would be willing to come and give a short talk to go along with this wonderful exhibit, she told me what the topic was, and I immediately said, oh yes, I must come. And the reason was I had just been to another clock exhibition at Colonial Williamsburg, and the image that you see on the screen is from that exhibition. And I had been so fascinated to see this forest of of clocks lined up like this. And just to give you a sense, if you had come into the exhibition gallery when I was there, I have to confess, you would have found me lying on the floor with my camera trying to capture that sense of the forest of these marvelous objects, because rarely would they have been seen together like this outside. A few of them maybe keeping company in a cabinet maker's shop or in the context of a museum or an auction gallery. These tall clocks were singular artifacts, and they, in the American context, actually have a relatively short period when they were not just the height of fashion, but like the Cadillac of the furniture world. And in probate inventory after probate inventory that I have looked at, you will find them only in very elite households, and oftentimes the most expensive item in the probate outside of livestock and in some cases enslaved people. They were very valuable and much appreciated items. So my focus here today, as Greer intimated, is not going to be so much the focus on the clockmaker or even the cabinet maker per se, so much as looking at the way in which they sourced materials and translated them into artifacts, and then sort of following the trail, if you will, from the gallery, from the object, back to the rainforest where these trees once grew. And that actually was the focus of my research that I actually was I did my master's degree at Winterthur Museum and really became enthralled with the beauty of these artifacts. And as I talk about this in the introduction to my book, I remember talking to the curators back then and asking them, places like Philadelphia, New Jersey, New England, they had tons of beautiful trees. That was one of the things Europeans were so excited about coming to colonial America. They had beautiful, massive oak trees and walnut trees and cherry trees. So why did they feel this need to go thousands of miles away, to have to bring enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean into the rainforest to extricate these trees and bring them back to New England and New Jersey and New York and all of the leading seaports, where they were exporting certain kinds of trees to the Caribbean, and they were importing mahogany from the Caribbean back here. And so I don't really have time to get into the nuances of this, about the aesthetics that were involved with that and the ideas of sort of emulative consumption, because this really begins in Europe, and then people in colonial America kind of follow along with that. But the upshot of it was, by around beginning in the 17th century, already you're having a little bit of mahogany coming in. But by about the mid-18th century, not just elite families, but even middling families in colonial America were furnishing their homes with tropical hardwoods, primarily mahogany. And it just becomes the thing that was done. And so I was just really intrigued by why this happens, how it happens so quickly, and then sort of the trajectory of that. But since I'm a labor historian and an environmental historian, as well as a cultural historian, kind of play in different sandboxes and bring things together in different ways, I was interested not just in the hands and the labor of the cabinet maker, but sort of, again, tracing that back to the people who were felling these trees in the rainforest and everyone in between. The same problem that I had trying to photograph these case clocks, which are like 8-9 feet tall. Some of them I've seen like 11, 12 foot. Usually those are English examples. I had the same problem trying to photograph a mahogany tree. They're just too big. But I thought it was kind of fun to juxtapose them here to kind of get that, that kind of thinking. And here's my blatant advertising. This is the book that came out of this research. And again, sort of looking at the cultural history, the social history of this material that became so ubiquitous in American homes during the colonial period. So I want to focus in on a few clocks. I didn't unfortunately have images of the ones here, but I was able to pull a couple from other sources, especially Colonial Williamsburg, since I was just down there, of examples of magnificent case clocks. And what's interesting is most of the ones that you see in the American context where they really begin to proliferate, there are some, again, in the 1750s and earlier, they're quite rare, but by around, after the Revolution, they kind of have their height, and there's quite a blossoming, actually, of New York and New Jersey and Philadelphia to some degree, clockmakers as well as cabinet makers. And the important caveat here is that in most cases, those weren't necessarily the same people, different skill sets. And so most early case clocks that you see in an American context, the works actually more than likely were made in England or possibly the Netherlands or somewhere else in Europe. And then some of the very earliest examples, the case might be imported as well. But as soon as you begin to have a cabinet making industry that's viable in the American colonies, clockmakers, importers of clocks, and then you begin to get local clockmakers working in concert with cabinet makers. And so you might very often have an English clock, but the case is made in America. And if you think about the cost of shipping something, right, wouldn't it make sense that you would ship that expensive mechanism, and then you can go down to your local cabinet maker and have a case made to your own aesthetic taste, to the proportions of your home, et cetera, as long as it's, comparable to what the Joneses have next door. So some of these clocks, the works are English, yes?
We can see what looks like apprenticeships that made clock that look like the clockmakers they learned from, but yeah, English pieces within those workings for sure.
Yeah, so that was quite common. So it's a little bit tricky. So for example, this clock, looking at how the label was at Colonial Williamsburg, it's attributed to William Dawes, but he actually was a clockmaker. So I was like, wait a minute, if he was a clockmaker, who is making the case? And the label doesn't include that information. But this one is kind of neat because we actually have a history of ownership. We know where it was made, we know when it was made, and we know the materials that it was made up of. And I think I actually have a photo here that shows you the exterior material. So anything that you can see looking directly on the clock, the way it's correctly positioned against the wall, you only see the beautiful mahogany. And if you've honed in on details, you can see the cabinet maker has really taken some care in choosing the different pieces of mahogany to create this sort of sense of swirl and movement using that mahogany. Wait, I thought backwards. So if you, the detail that I just showed you is this piece right here, and the door, where this is one board. And so the beautiful grain of it swirls all the way down the piece. Here's another example by the same clockmaker, and very likely the same cabinet maker, but again, unattributed here. And you'll notice in the high federal style, very rectilinear, lots of symmetry, and again, a very exquisite selection of mahogany. There. We take the hood off, you get a little peek inside the mechanism, and you begin to see that not only was this cabinet maker working for Dawes, this is another example by a New Jersey cabinet maker where we do know the cabinet maker, and you can see that he has very carefully used the cheapest wood he can get away with on anything that you don't see. And so that's why the labels often will say that it's a combination of mahogany first, because that's what you see first, but then the inside is going to be whatever inexpensive local wood that he can source in order to cut his costs and increase his profit margin. Pretty smart, right? So this would most likely be a combination of poplar and oak, usually hardwoods that are pretty stable. Pine would be a good one. And so what's interesting is a family like Egerton, they actually were in the cabinet business making, as was typical, over a couple of generations. And father passing on skills and tools and materials to their son, who apprentices with them, and then on to the grandson. And so you always have to be very careful when you're looking in the records that you know which Egerton, which generation, and the dates are matching up. And all of them are using mahogany. But what's interesting when you actually start to look at where they would have been sourcing mahogany, you begin to see a different story emerges, because not all mahogany was equal. And over time, where they were sourcing it changes. And I began to realize this from looking at newspaper ads of where people were advertising the wood was coming from, and then beginning to realize that it changes over time. And so that then kind of led me back to this larger environmental story about what was happening, where the mahogany was being sourced. So famous quote from Ben Franklin that I cite in my book, when he wanted to build a piece of a box to hold some scientific equipment. He goes to his cabinet maker, 1780, and he says, "Recollect, if you can, the species of mahogany of which you made my previous box, for you know there's a great deal of difference in woods that go under that name." And I read this, and I thought, what a curious thing to say. And then I start examining the kinds of discourses and the kind of concerns and problems that were beginning to arise, and realizing why this concern about deceitfulness and mahogany merchants trying to pass things off that weren't as good as our intrepid Franklin expected. And this is the story. If you trace through the newspapers from around 1750 right up until the 1830s, 40s, 50s, you see a changing roster of names that is linked to geographical places, real places. And what's fascinating is over time, people begin to use these interchangeably. Anything that's mahogany, they associate, they'll call it, oh, it's Santo Domingo mahogany, because that's what was fashionable at a particular time. And you see all the different places where this was being harvested. These names come and go in the newspapers as each island is deforested and the woodcutters shift to the next venue. So the first ads that we find for mahogany, I think I have one in here in a minute, they don't say where it's from. They just say mahogany, because there's only one source of where the mahogany is being cut, coming out of the Caribbean, predominantly out of Jamaica and the larger islands, with the exclusion initially of Haiti and Puerto Rico, because they were in Spanish hands. So I'm talking really just about British America and England. So initially, if you'd said mahogany, you meant trees that were being cut down as sugar cane was being planted in the Caribbean. And those trees were being felled faster than anyone knew what to do with them. And they begin to try and send them to Europe and promote them as a new material, and it kind of catches on in England. And then people in America also start using mahogany as well. And the second species that I'll talk about in a minute is basically really only begins to be used after the most desirable mahogany out of the Caribbean is no longer commercially viable because the trees have all been cut down, leaving just the least developed or ones that had some flaw with them, and it's just not commercially viable anymore. And ironically, Honduran mahogany, which is a related species but has rather different qualities, initially people looked down on it. But when the Caribbean mahogany isn't available anymore, suddenly Honduran mahogany becomes sort of the new hot thing. So this was the story that I was trying to trace, is how can we see the way in which this environmental story, this ecological transformation, is reflected back in the marketplace, and the way in which what consumers are asking for and merchants and cabinet makers are trying to supply gets this sort of dynamic going of environmental transformation. And so as I said, you really see it from the first half of the 18th century, almost all the mahogany coming into England and into colonial North America would have been coming out of the Sugar Islands, as they were called, the West Indies. And they were being harvested predominantly by enslaved workers, but oftentimes it would be either a planter who was expanding his sugar plantation and needed to clear more land, cutting down all that tree. Initially, they just burned it. It wasn't worth it. There's nobody wanted it, so they just burned. Nobody knows, what vast extents of mahogany forest was just burned. And then slowly they begin to export it, and it begins to get more and more popular. That particular table actually on the right, it's about this big, and that's one board, which gives you a sense of the age of these trees that were coming. And American cabinet makers had, as I said, they had lots of ample timber here, but the qualities of mahogany, it's a very dense wood, it has these rich colors, it carves really crisply. There are lots of things about it that made it something that cabinet makers appreciated, and that they encourage their clientele also to appreciate. And here is another famous example. This, I think, highlights one of the aesthetic qualities of it, the way it could be carved. And you see some lovely carving on the clocks here, but this is really a virtuoso example by Thomas Affleck. And this particular table, actually, you see it depicted in the family portrait by the Cadwalladers, which gives you a sense of the status associated with this. You have your portrait painted, you have it sitting at your beautiful tea table or leaning on your exquisite card table, as you see here. And so this ad is around 1790, and still you'll notice that they're describing mahogany, and they don't say where it's from. So that's what really begins to change, is that you can no longer just say mahogany, because the customer will say, well, where is it from? What kind of mahogany? And you see consumers becoming more and more discerning. And the reason for that is that West Indian mahogany that used to be, the best, has gone into ill repute, and people are very skeptical of it. But here in the 1790s, they're still advertising all kinds of different things, including timepieces, clock cases of various prices. And always cabinet makers would be offering, the whole array of different things that they were making at different price points. So depending on what you could afford or what a person's taste was, you could have something made, an inexpensive version made in pine. You could have a lovely, like Egerton, for example, made beautiful case clocks out of cherry wood. Or if you want to spend a little more, you've already spent so much money, right, on the beautiful clock itself, that then you might splurge and say, okay, we're not going to scrimp on the case and have a mahogany case made. And the differential in price could be significant. So the choice of mahogany could be several times what a lesser wood would be. And yeah, so this is actually one of the very first representations of this as a botanical specimen, was recorded by Mark Catesby in 1725. So right beginning of the 18th century. And he's saying already, right, it's known, it's familiar, and making its way into homes. And if we look at this map from 1756, I think this one is, I'm sorry, the date got a little cut off. You have someone describing Jamaica, the main source for mahogany, describing how it thrives in every soil, varies in its grain and texture. That which grows among the rocks is small and hard and weighty, but of close grain and beautifully shaded. So it has a beautiful pattern. But the mahogany of the low and richer lands is light and porous. So you get a sense, right? There's this whole connoisseurship that has grown up around Jamaican mahogany, and the quality of the wood depended on where it grew. And so if the wood was coming from high in the mountains and enslaved people had to hike up there and haul the trees down, that would be more expensive than things that were being cut around the edges. But during this time period, as I mentioned before, the most important thing in the West Indies was not getting money off of timber. That was seen as just a windfall. It was a one-time thing. You cut these trees down, they were gone. But if you cut them down and planted sugarcane, then you could have crop after crop after crop. And so in fact, mahogany often was cut down, and the money that the planters made, they would pour back into developing their sugar plantation and often also buying more enslaved people. So 20 years later, so that last slide I think was, I might have gotten the date wrong, it's like 1750, this is 1774, 20 years later, and Edward Long, who was one of the leading planters on Jamaica, actually goes back to England to try and promote development on Jamaica. And here he describes mahogany, Jamaica's mahogany, once so exceedingly plentiful that the first houses were built of this wood, it's almost exterminated except in mountainous recesses. So if we have our first generation of Egerton cabinet maker back in New Jersey making mahogany furniture, it most likely would have been coming out of Jamaica. But his son and his grandson, probably not. It probably would have been coming from a different part of the world. And what's so interesting to me about that is the way we begin to then see this getting caught up into the larger geopolitical events of the era. And the reason for that is that where the English had controlled all of this beautiful mahogany forest and they cut it down and plant sugar and go looking for more mahogany, they very quickly run into a problem, which is that they've tapped out, almost extinct, Swietenia, that first species still exists, but not commercially harvested really to any large extent. So they have to switch to the other species, as I mentioned. But there's tons of it. It's massive. It's not as good as what people had grown to expect, but good enough. Second best becomes suddenly first best, right? But it's only in areas that are controlled by Spain. And so the English, it's fascinating, they basically go in like squatters. And in my book, I actually follow some of these woodcutters. So they come from Newport and other parts of colonial America. Some of them come from England. And they basically go down and sneak into Spanish territory, bringing enslaved people with them, and start cutting these trees down and hope the Spanish don't notice. Unfortunately, the Spanish actually are pretty observant, and they have their Coast Guard going up and down the coast. And this one little area that you see In the circle, that is now the country of Belize, which those of you who know that part of the world, something distinctive about Belize, it's the only part of Central America where the first language is English. This is why. Because it becomes so contentious, because these English woodcutters, they just keep coming back. And the Spanish Coast Guard comes and confiscates their wood or burns it, confiscates their slaves and frees them, and encourages their enslaved people to run away, so that there becomes this contest between the Spanish and the English to try and control these workers, and the workers actually get a little bit of leverage in that they're able to use to their advantage in some ways. But it becomes so violent that in 1786, at the end of the 7 Years' War, while all kinds of other things are on the drawing board, this is, remember, when New France, the French get kicked out of North America after the 7 Years' War. The other, we don't talk about this much. The other thing that was on the bargaining table was access to this woodcutting area. And it's part of the treaty, along with, kicking out the French from Canada and a number of other things that things get exchanged hands. But one of the things that the English are very adamant about is they want to negotiate that they're going to have access to this area in order to get the mahogany. And the Spanish would have loved to just control it and sell it to the English at high prices, but they have this, these squatters are so persistent that it's just not worth it to them to keep trying to police it. And so, quite wonderful, this map, huge big map in the British archives. And it's very difficult to see, but I was able to actually trace one of the woodcutters who was from Newport. His brother was a merchant involved with the slave trade and the tropical trade. And he goes down, so the brother goes, is moving the mahogany back and forth, and his brother buys a group of enslaved people, brings them into the rainforest, and it works very well until they have a big fight, and I don't know exactly what happened, but his name is on here, all the different places where he had claims to mahogany areas. And this has to be documented in the treaty with the Spanish. So as I said, what happens is so fascinating, because the locus of mahogany production shifts from that very close, relatively small area of the Sugar Islands, where once the trees were cut down, all of the enslaved people basically get put to work growing sugar, and it's very cumbersome labor. But in the mahogany forests of Belize, they actually get a fair amount of autonomy. They're able to come and go as they want in the forest, and they are the ones who develop the expertise about where to find the trees, because they actually grow quite spread out in the rainforest. And they develop a system of gangs where each gang had what was called a hunter who was in charge. He would climb high up in the canopy of the tree and look out over the top of the rainforest and figure out where the mahogany trees were. And this was the thing that really caught my interest. In the archive, it says that then the hunter comes down and he confers with himself whether he will tell his master what he has found, or if he will go and tell one of the other baymen, as they were known, who would give him a better price. And it's really interesting to see these dynamics. On the other hand, the downside of that is that all of their women and children were kept and usually held in the port city, so that the men would come back, because their women and children were essentially kept hostage there. But we do have records of these mahogany cutters going out into the forest and just never coming back. Some of them go and into Spanish territory and get their freedom, And others, we don't know. They may have, they knew how to live off the land, so they may just have become maroons, living, taking their own freedom and living in the rainforest. Here's another image just to give you a sense of the kind of incredible laborious work that they were doing. Logging still today is one of the most dangerous of occupations. It certainly was then. And well into the early 19th century, they were doing all of this work by hand. They would cut the trees down and using ox teams, haul them to the closest river and pile them up until the rainy season. And then when the rains came and the rivers rose, they would float them down to the harbor and would load them onto ships heading off to different places. And what's fascinating is these bay men become sort of like we see in Australia, where all the former convicts who emigrate to Australia become sort of the new founding generation. You see very similar thing happen in Belize. And many of the people who ended up there were people who were either expelled because they got into some kind of legal problem or had some other challenges that they end up, this is sort of considered the end of the earth. And in fact, slaves who get involved in uprisings, many of them actually are sent down to Honduras if they're considered incorrigible. This is where you send them. And so today, the bay men, there's a lot of discussion about sort of how to characterize them. They called themselves the new aristocracy. And at the time, one of the critics described them as a very arbitrary aristocracy. So to kind of circle back of where we see this environmental story kind of pick up again, is that even as Honduras becomes the new center of mahogany production, you see the same challenges. Takes a little longer, but similar patterns of unsustainability within this industry. And very soon, by the early 19th century, all of the areas that had been approved under the treaty for English woodcutters were cut out. And I was really fascinated to find this map in the British archives. And a lot of the same names are still there that I showed you on that earlier map in the 1780s. Same families are there, but area after area on the map is labeled cut out, cut out, cut out. And what happens is, of course, these woodcutters start to push further and further and further into Spanish territory. And ultimately, the British finally have to negotiate, and they're able to secure Belize, and it becomes a British protectorate. And that contestation with the Spanish finally comes to an end. But by then, most of the trees are gone, and they're fighting with each other over what was left. And the landscape really is transformed, and many of these former woodcutters either have to go elsewhere or they end up shifting to other things like ranching and that sort of thing. And I'm realizing I'm out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up. I've got just a couple slides to give you a sense of sort of, initially, remember I said you didn't even have to say where mahogany came from because people knew it all came out of Jamaica. By the time you get to the early 19th century, it's become like a moving target where it's coming from. And every ad is trying to promote where it's coming from, trying to get an edge on the market. Oh, it's coming out of Santo Domingo, in other words, out of Haiti. Oh, it's coming out of Cuba, or it's coming out of the Bay, so out of Honduras. And you'll notice on that first ad, the way that they're promoting this is by emphasizing the fact that we're not just taking any old thing. We actually have an expert. We send an expert down to choose the wood, to go down into the Caribbean, and actually it says this wood was selected on the spot by a person of the trade who went from hence on purpose It is said by good judges to be one of the handsomest assortments of table wood. So in the 1750s, you would rarely have seen something like this because the overall quality was so good. And now they were having to reassure people. And in fact, many cabinet making shops in New York and Philadelphia and elsewhere, they would actually have one of the younger sons would become he wasn't going to take over the shop. He would be the one who gets sent down to earn his stripes as a wood sourcer. And many of those same cabinet making families become the wood surveyors, grading and assessing the quality as it's coming back. So really interconnected more and more with this larger story of environmental transformation, that most of the people going into a shop to order their clock, right, would not really have any awareness of this. It's, I think, one factor. As you get into the around the 1820s, 1830s, enormous grandfather clocks, as we call them today, begin to go out of fashion. And part of that is new technology, part of that is changing tastes. Clocks get much smaller. You get mantle clocks. The technology changes, so instead of having to have a long pendulum, you can have a spring mechanism that can be in any smaller clock. And you don't have to spend a small fortune getting an entire mahogany tree to be the case of your clock. And if you look at clocks from this time period, they are made with almost always with very thin mahogany veneers that would just be a tiny slice of what those clock cases once would have been. The other thing, if you didn't have veneer, you could always use paint. And the place where my woodcutters, I say that very possessively, the woodcutters I researched, they were cutting trees in a place called Spanish Creek in Belize. Massive, massive trees that furnish some of the finest houses of Rhode Island. It looks like this today. And yes, so as we say on the cover of my book, that was one of the hidden costs of the luxury of mahogany and the backstory of some of our wonderful clocks. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. That was fantastic. So now we have time for questions. Peter, and I'm just going to give you the mic.
Is there still a mahogany market? And if so, where is the mahogany coming from? And why didn't they replant?
Oh, excellent questions. I'll start with the second one first, because that seems really intuitive. Why didn't they just replant? And that was one of my first questions too. And part of the trickiness about mahogany, the species that were used commercially for furniture making, is that they turn out to be quite ecologically complex. They grow, their entire life cycle, if you will, is integral with their rainforest environment. So when planters they'd cut down the forest and they would try to plant mahogany in order to have it for future, like one of these planters describes it as the nursery for my children's future. And unfortunately, when you take the trees out of their natural ecological niche, they turn out to be highly susceptible to different kind of pests, and they didn't mature as quickly. Many of them would die before. And frankly, these guys didn't have a lot of patience, because you had to plant a tree and wait 100 years. So it was to get the kind of wood that they were accustomed to. And that's why it becomes this race to find more and moving and pressing into new areas all the time. And interestingly, in the 1790s, they actually tried to transplant mahogany to grow it in India. and they have the same kind of problems. And ironically, in the 20th century, the area that I just showed you, instead of replanting mahogany there, they're growing eucalyptus trees imported from Indonesia, which grow very quickly. Yeah. What was the other question?
Is there a mahogany market now?
Oh, yes, there is. And mahogany, all of the species are protected under the sites as endangered species. And so it's very closely regulated. And most of what's still being commercially harvested is coming out of parts of Honduras that are still being very controlled harvesting, so that they can't clear cut the way was once done, selective cutting. And there are other things that are similar to mahogany that are being sort of marketed as mahogany. And a lot of sort of second quality wood is used for things like decks and anything like boardwalks and things like that, that would be a quality of mahogany that wasn't what was used for this kind of fine furniture making. And so that's most of what you see. Yeah.
How much would a mahogany clock, how much would the case cost?
It's tricky because usually the prices are listed with both of them. But my favorite description, there was a period account that says a good tall case clock costs a cow and a calf. And so it could be, it's difficult to translate. So for example, I've seen in the 1820s, it might be $9, but that doesn't, you have to actually do the monetary conversion. But mahogany over one of the other materials, it could easily be, many times what it would cost to have it done in a local wood that was readily available. But one of the statistics that really caught my attention was that one clock scholar was describing these shorter mantle clocks, and he said they're 7 times cheaper than to have a grandfather clock, a tall case clock made in the early 19th century. So I think that gives you a sense for why those smaller clocks become so popular. And, the grandfather clock, as it becomes popularly known, becomes sort of an archaic artifact that has more to do with heritage than it does with, the economics of timekeeping.
Just following up. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Your talk was just brilliant. Thank you. Following up on the most recent question about cost, where are the account books are there any surviving account books, day books, whatever, of these tradespeople?
There are. Usually they tend to be quite fragmentary. So, New Jersey clocks, there was one winter tour thesis written about them by Peter Wisby that it's actually available online. But again, usually it'll just be a snapshot that you might have one little, one period that's represented, but not necessarily the whole period. So that's why in my book, I actually look at a lot of different things, and the sort of score that the gold mine that I discovered actually was in Rhode Island, was that the Card family, because their letters back and forth between the merchant that they worked for and his representative in London. And they write letters back and forth talking about, what is the market like for mahogany, and the guy in England is always complaining about the quality isn't good enough, and so that there's this correspondence back and forth that's really fascinating. So there are a fair number of account books from cabinet makers in places like the Historical Society of Massachusetts, and Deerfield has some. And, but again, you have to take into consideration if they're rural or if they're urban. One of my favorites actually was a little kind of a day book that was kept by a apprentice to a cabinet maker, where he describes what he's working, and most of what they allow the apprentice to work in is just gumwood. Like they don't trust him with the expensive mahogany, but he talks about going to New York. So this is in rural Massachusetts, that his boss, the master cabinet maker, is away because he had to go to New York to get more mahogany veneers. And meanwhile, the apprentices are back there, getting into all kinds of mischief.
Did you say the name was Carter on the Newport family?
Card, C-A-R-D. Yeah.
One of the, good evening. My wife and I have done some research on some of the effects not only of mahogany itself, but also the political aspects of what occurred during the Intolerable Acts, to find that the added cost of mahogany was that you had to pay a tax on it, yes, because it was imported, but you also had to pay for the mahogany as if it went to England, repurposed, and then came back to America, which added to it. And keeping Yankee ingenuity in front of us, we were able to find a Salem wing chair in which the front two legs are mahogany and the back two legs are cherry, stained to look like mahogany, so that talk about making the best of the deal. And
that's a great story, and that doesn't surprise me, because they were, any way that they could increase their profit margin, for sure. And almost every piece of American furniture, if you can't see, some aspect of it, it's gonna not be the fancy wood, unless it's like the beautiful interior of a really stellar object.
I'd like to just add, particularly in New Jersey, we found that the cherry pieces that were made to look like mahogany are actually so prized by collectors, mahoganized graining, that they bring a premium price over mahogany.
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? Yeah, and actually cherry wood was prized because of the reddish color, and it was always like, it's like mahogany. And today, right, collectors love, prefer that. But your other point about customs duties, this was a very contentious issue in England and in the colonies as well, because the cabinet makers felt themselves at a disadvantage, and they're always lobbying to try and get those customs duties lifted. And at one point, they do lift the customs duties in around 1720. And one of the theories about why mahogany begins to get more popular then is that might have helped make the price lower, at least temporarily.
We did find some sources from Africa.
Yes.
Darker black mahogany. And you're so right on about the gradations of many people consider some of the Bay Island mahogany a weed, compared to the, let's say, Santo Domingo mahogany.
Santo Domingo, yeah.
But there was also a mahogany that I just had to explain to someone today, matter of fact, which was called Sabaku, the horseflesh mahogany, and that the area in the, I believe it's the south part of Cuba, actually not in the rainforest, but pretty close to the coast, has a large rocks that this mahogany grows in. It's very stony. So these trees grow enormously. And we happen to be able to procure a table for somebody in Sabaku, and the top is one board. Okay.
Wow.
But then it's now a national treasure in Cuba. And I said, this will get you 7 years of hard labor. And somebody else said, what else won't?
Well, it's really interesting because, mahogany, that label gets such cachet that when woodcutters, they end up, American woodcutters, I actually interviewed one gentleman who unfortunately has passed away now, but his family had a cabinet making firm in Philadelphia from the 1830s until the company was bought by an international conglomerate. But when he was a young man, he had been sent by his family. He was cutting wood first in in Mexico and Cuba, and then in Brazil, and then they send them to Africa. And eventually they get, there's some political turmoil and the company gets kicked out. But what's interesting is what they're selling is mahogany coming out of Africa. It's a completely different species. They just name it. It becomes like a marketplace name. So, Benjamin Franklin was right when you said you have to be pretty careful about that. Yeah, it's protected in most places, and yeah, you can definitely get into a lot of trouble. Like there's some musical instrument companies recently have gotten into some serious challenges because they're sourcing not just mahogany but other tropical hardwoods that are endangered, and it's so hard for them to know exactly where it came from that now actually cabinet makers are trying to have, for the last few years, actually been putting together their own sort of like a fair trade kind of thing like you have with coffee to verify where mahogany is being cut in order to not further endanger an already endangered species.
I'm very intrigued on the cover of your book, on how you chose that. Somehow you wouldn't expect a woman, you expect maybe a beautiful piece of furniture or something. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, I can take no credit for that. That was the inspiration of a designer at Harvard University Press, which is kind of funny because I had sent them a lot of images that are in the book, and they sent this back. And I remember very vividly opening the file. So it's on my computer. So I pressed the button, opened the file, and it kind of took my breath away because it caught so much what I'm trying to do in the book, of this way in which people saw themselves reflected, and then the hidden toll of slavery sort of beneath the surface. In fact, there's some marvelous quotes from Dickens and others during the era of abolition, where as a call to conscience, they tell people, when you look into the mahogany dining table and you see your beautiful reflection, look deeper, listen closer, and you will see this hidden slavery, you will hear the suffering, you will see that vivid red color and think of the blood of the workers who toiled to do this. And ironically, there were critics of abolition who made fun of people for signing pledges not to use sugar while writing on their mahogany table.
This has been fascinating, but I have to ask you, how did you become interested in this topic?
I got interested in this topic actually when I was initially when I was a student at Winter Museum. They have this master's program, and the learning laboratory is actually working in the galleries. And I remember, crawling around and looking at the furniture and like asking, just like why would people in New England, where there's nothing but trees and rocks, why would they go to all this trouble to get this mahogany? And the curators kind of shook their heads and said, well, we don't really, nobody's really asked that question before. They're like, well, it comes from, the cabinet maker's workshop. And I was like, yeah, but how did it get there? And, you pull a thread and you start following it. And that is really what I did. But it was interesting. It was actually, I graduated from Winterthur and I went off and, became a museum curator and did a whole other thing. And it was only 10 years later that I came back and I was looking for a topic for a dissertation. And I couldn't think of anything. And I went down to Winterthur, and I had a lovely librarian who's now long since retired, and she was sort of the keeper of the wisdom there. And I said, Neville, I'm looking for a topic that brings together people and ecology and stuff. And she said, like this, she said, mahogany. Thank you, Neville. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Dr. Anderson, and thank you all for being such a great great audience and for being here tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and thanks for supporting Morven and Striking Beauty as well.